So how you been, man?
I've been doing okay still, right?
Yeah. Um, and you'd asked me a question on the Scuffed podcast, which I don't know if I answered coherently.
Oh
But
yeah,
you said you had
it's an
lots of
interesting question of
you said you had lots of questions.
um yeah, fuck. You guys were talking about wait, am I allowed to say fuck here?
I guess so. I don't know.
Okay, well I'm just because it's your
You've
stream.
been
I
doing
don't know
this
if you
longer than I have.
Yeah, sure, but I don't know if you have different rules for your stream, right?
I don't know what the rules of my stream. I
Well,
say
I
fuck.
imagine you have some rules for your stream, right?
I say fuck.
Okay, gotcha. All right, we're gonna say fuck. Um it's always been a really interesting question to me, the difference between like respecting a person's autonomy
Mhm.
versus superseding their autonomy for what you perceive to be their benefit. That question is a really hard one, I feel. Um, so in the case where if you have somebody that you know is suicidal and has the means and the desire to, commit suicide, um, what kind of state of mind do they have to be in for you to respect their decision is basically the a question that I've kind of wrestled with a lot.
So when you say you, do
hmm
you mean me or do you mean a person?
When I say you for person who is suicidal or person who is considering stopping somebody from committing suicide.
Yeah. So if the person who's considering stopping someone,
Uh-huh.
who is the you? Like a general person or me?
Uh, well, I mean, at one point in my life, it was me. It could be anybody. I imagine for you, it's probably a bit different.
It
If you're
is.
working in the capacity of a therapist, you have an
Yep.
obligation,
Exactly.
to contact somebody. Yeah, obviously so. Yeah, it's more just kind of like a question of philosophy in general, not necessarily an occupational question.
Yeah, so I think the main thing that I look at is whether they have. So if we think about consent and
hmm
choice,
Yeah,
so when does a doctor? So we're going to talk about doctors for a second, and then we can
sure.
expand. When does a doctor have the right to overcome someone's choice? And
hmm
generally speaking, we have the right when we deem their consciousness or their decision making capacity
hmm
to be impaired.
Yeah.
And so what I do in terms of like if someone's depressed, like they'll make statements that really suggest that they're impaired. So if someone says the world would be better off without me,
hmm
and generally speaking, I mean, I imagine that that can be true in some cases, but generally speaking, most people will, their family members don't actually want to see them die, or their friends. And so that suggests to me that their cognitive process is impaired at some point. So if they have the capacity to make good decisions, and that can be impaired by mental illness.
hmm
Um, so that's one piece. Thoughts?
So there's an interesting catch-22 that's kind of brought up here, where some people look at things like medically assisted suicide. And some people will say, hey, we ought to have the ability to end our lives should we choose to. Now, for some people, this is just a question of like end of life stuff. So, for instance, if you're dying of a terminal disease, should you be able to? But for other people, they say, well, if you're in your 20s or 30s, if you're suffering or combating mental illness, you should have the ability to, end your life if you choose to. Um, some people would say that the criteria for determining whether or not you're of sound mind will always preclude somebody from committing suicide, though. So
Why?
for instance, yeah, so how do you is so the question is like, well, if somebody feels suicidal, I think for a person of healthy mind, you would say, well, there must be some sort of like cognitive impairment there, which would then make it so that nobody could essentially ever commit suicide. Not that I'm advocating for it, it sounds like I am, I'm sorry, but yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that catch-22? Is there ever a spot where somebody could be of sound mind, where they're not suffering from a terminal disease and they want to commit suicide, I guess?
So I'm going to say something once again, which I think we have to be careful. I'm not advocating for
Yeah,
suicide.
of course. Yeah. Sorry, this conversation is
So
really weird to have publicly.
yep,
Sorry. Yeah.
yep. No, no, it's a
Uh-huh.
good I think it's an important conversation. So I'll say something that I think may be a little bit shocking. I'd say half of the people that I've worked with that are suicidal are not
Mhm.
suicidal due to a mental illness. So we have
They're
a
not suicidal due to
biggest
mental illness, you said?
not due to mental illness.
No.
So
Okay, gotcha.
this
Yeah.
is a really interesting assumption that has started to happen in our society.
hmm
So suicidality is a symptom, right, of a
hmm
mental illness. So it's a sign, like if you're bipolar or you have trauma or you're depressed, you can be suicidal, but you can also have none of those things and be suicidal. So the
Sure.
first thing to understand is that suicidality is not exclusive to mental illness. So if you look at, like, for example, Japanese culture, or, even like suicide bombers, like, I mean, you can make an argument about whether they're mentally ill or not. But there's evidence culturally that people have motives for suicide that are not due to mental illness. And the most shocking thing that I've encountered is actually working with people who are suicidal and they're not actually like cognitively impaired. So they may sound like they're depressed, but they genuinely like look at a life where they don't see a way forward. And so they just want to tap out. And if you really like assess them in terms of depression, they don't meet the DSM criteria. Oh, maybe I see a lot of people who move to sub mode, but maybe I said something that was not really good. But there are people who I've talked to, and it's scary. So like, they're my patients, but I wouldn't diagnose them with like clinical depression. So there are certain criteria of clinical depression which they don't meet. I still think that they shouldn't kill themselves. And I work with them to work on their suicidal so that they're no longer suicidal, and I tend to be generally successful at that. But I do think that it's possible to be suicidal and not have mental illness. And then coming to your catch-22, so I think the issue there is, do you assume that suicidality comes from mental illness? Because if you don't assume that, then the catch-22 goes away, right? Because the argument that I'm hearing is that suicidality is evidence of mental illness, therefore it's a catch-22, and no one can ever kill themselves.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be very careful with my words. I wouldn't say necessarily I wouldn't necessarily say evidence of mental illness. I would say evidence of people would say evidence of mental impairment. So, for instance, when you say somebody could not be mentally ill but still could be suicidal, like, I'm curious because I could read that in two ways. One I could read is that if you're not mentally ill and you're suicidal, then on either one hand, then you are perfectly within your rights to feel suicidal. Like, it seems like you're not mentally impaired, so you have all the tools available to you to make that decision. But then on the second hand, I could say, like, well, you're not mentally ill and you're still suicidal. That seems incredibly irrational. Like, there's no reason for this at all. Which way do you lean then on that? Are you leaning more towards the former than the latter, or?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So, like, if somebody doesn't have a mental illness and they're suicidal, would you assume then that that decision is very reasonable because they don't have a mental illness and they're able to think through it? Or would you assume that it's very unreasonable because you're not even mentally ill, yet you still feel suicidal?
I don't like the word reasonable. So I'd say that I'd say it's understandable, right? So I don't think that people should kill themselves, but
Yeah,
I
of
think
course. Yeah,
starting
yeah.
off with the presumption that the reason you want to kill yourself is because you're impaired is an incredibly invalidating approach,
Sure.
right? It discounts their entire perspective. If we say, oh, you're suicidal because your brain is busted, there's something wrong with you, that just completely invalidates any actual concerns they have about the world. So I don't think that that's actually healthy. So I think it's, in a sense, it's reasonable. And that's how you get it to change, right? Like, you meet them kind of where they're at. If someone says, I'm 35 years old, I've never been on a date with a girl, then I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life, I want to kill myself. Like, it's reasonable, I think, for them to feel that way. And also, I don't think they should do that. And that's what you have to work on. Because the cool thing is, as you talk to someone about their reasons for suicidality, you then begin to see the path of how to make them not suicidal. Because if what they want is like companionship in life, like, that's what you should work on. And
Yeah,
getting them.
I agree with you there. The only worry then is that how reflective can you be without, like, um without, I don't want to say without pushing them towards it, but, like, say a person feels somewhat suicidal, they express those concerns to you and they give the reasons why. You're understanding and reflective of the language they use, and then they feel like they've gotten affirmation in that, and then they commit suicide because they feel like their feelings have been validated. Is that a worry ever, or?
So the data actually suggests that talking to people and validating their feelings of suicide does not increase suicidal behavior. So that's a big concern that people have, right? Is that you don't talk about it. And if you talk about it and you validate them, they're more likely to do it. Whereas in my experience, it's been the exact opposite. So what happens when you validate their experience is then, like, at least one person understands them. And then if I understand them and then I say, hey, like maybe you shouldn't do this yet. Like, can we work on this for a little while? The response that I get overwhelming is like, yeah, okay, fine. So I actually
Gotcha.
find
Okay.
that, in validating someone's suicidal feelings and understanding the depth of their despair is the first step in like helping them change their life.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say like, yeah, your complaints are dumb, then like
Mm-hmm.
how are you going to change your life?
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting.
Does that resolve your catch 22 or no?
Um. Well, so my original catch 22 was that it feels like being suicidal in and of itself can be evidence of some sort of impairment. Your response is that that's not necessarily true, that you can still approach a person who is suicidal. You can be reflective with your language. You can have a conversation with them. What do you do? So I guess chasing that down a little bit more. What do you do if you are reflective? You do have those conversations, but they're still pretty set on committing suicide in a non-professional role. What do you think, you have an extra legal obligation there, or extra moral obligation there to intervene, or what?
Yeah, I think you do have a moral obligation to intervene because I don't know that the average person is able to assess for capacity,
Mhm.
right? So we're professionally trained in assessing someone's capacity to make decisions and when
Mhm.
someone's thinking is impaired and when someone's thinking is not impaired. I don't know that the average person knows how to do that. So, like, I think because you're not professionally trained, it's something that if someone is about to kill themselves, I think you're morally obligated to try to intervene and at least get them evaluated by someone who is who knows how to evaluate suicide.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. And the other way to think about it is like this it may be incorrect at times, but like let me put it to you this way. If you're walking down the street and you see someone drowning in a lake, do you think you should try to help them?
In that case, yeah, for sure.
Right? But what if they are drowning as part of a suicide attempt?
I mean, I'm assuming you don't have access to that information, right? But
Exactly.
mhm.
So since you don't have access to the information of their impairment of mind, you err on the side of saving the life.
Mhm. And if you do have, like, a more intimate relationship with the person, what then do you still err on the side of they need to at least get one consultation with a professional first, or
Absolutely. Right? So like the fact that you're intimate with them may in turn impair your judgment
Mhm.
objectively. And so to have them get an evaluation by a professional, I think is absolutely a good idea.
Gotcha.
What do you
Okay.
think?
Um Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'll think about it. Usually for big topics like this, I usually sleep on it a few days, and then I have like a better opinion of it. But yeah, that's stuff to think about. Yeah.
It
What's
sounded
up?
like you had a lot of questions. Is that
Well, I mean, not like hours worth of questions. I was just really curious what your thing was down
okay?
this path. Well, how are you feeling in general?
Good overall.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, we're
Um,
yeah,
I spoke to you some number of months ago. Do you
yeah.
feel like your perspective at all has changed, being a little bit more in this world? Maybe not perspective on mental health, but like on like streamers in general or this world in general. Is there anything that's like surprised you or shocked you, or is everything panned out about as you thought it would? Or
So nothing has panned out how I thought it would.
hmm
I'd say that I have learned immense things. I think the biggest revelation that I've had is I think that our understanding of mental illness and mental pressure is woefully outdated.
hmm
And
what do
I
you mean
think
by that? Or I'm curious what you mean by that specifically. Mental
so,
illness and mental pressure.
yeah, so like the first thing is that the stresses that people go under are changing. That's why I call it mental pressure because I don't think it necessarily qualifies as illness.
Sure.
So, and I think that like there's a big mistake that's being made in the academic community. Well, a mistake is actually a little bit unfair.
hmm
There are some assumptions which are being made. So, for example, if you look at the criteria for proposed criteria for video game addiction, they're
Yeah.
essentially the same as alcohol addiction, with the word
Yeah.
alcohol replaced with video games.
Yeah, I think I saw similar with like gambling addiction too, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what they do is they say that all, and that basically has the presumption that all addictions are sort of the same. And it's been my experience that that is really not true. I
Hmm.
mean, so I'm an addiction psychiatrist generally in my day job, and like, working with a
Hmm.
heroin addict and working with like a video game addict, there's some overlap to be sure, but they feel like really discrete diseases with different kinds of solutions.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. So I think that in general, the kinds of pressures that people face, like when I talk to streamers and stuff, is like very, very different in some ways. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
Do you so I'm kind of curious on that road. Do you ever feel like when you bring up even the concept of being addicted to video games, do you ever feel like the pushback that you might get from somebody in the gaming community might be similar to an alcoholic? Like the denial that it could ever even be a problem? I noticed that sometimes. I remember when, I don't know if it was a proposed DSM thing or at the WHO, whoever initially came out with the video game addiction thing. I remember when I first read it, the language seemed a little bit vague, but it's like, yeah, I could totally see people being addicted to video games. But it seemed like gaming communities in general were incredibly hostile towards even the notion that video games could like lead to an unhealthy addiction. Do you ever see that pushback or?
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I think some people push back against the idea of the diagnosis. Like, that's an interesting question, right? Like, what happens? So this is a discussion that I haven't had much recently, but when
Mhm.
in its early days, when Healthy Gamer was like a group of like 50 strong, and we would meet once a week and talk about video game addiction, we would
Mhm.
talk about what does it mean to be labeled as an addict? What are the pros and what are the cons? Because there are advantages and there are
Yeah.
disadvantages.
Mhm.
So I think it's understandable that a lot of the community, so I think our community is misunderstood by society as a whole.
When you say our community, you mean gaming or
Yeah,
like your? Okay, yeah, okay, gotcha.
gaming, Twitch. And I
Mhm.
think what happens is that like what we see is, so let's say like I'm a 16-year-old kid and I have conflict with my mom, and when I see something about video game addiction, it gives her license to continue to, it gives her ammo in our arguments. Because like
Mm.
she can just say, I'm a fucking addict now. It's a
Yeah,
disease. The World Health Organization is concerned about it. So it actually gives people like an avenue to invalidate like gamers' experiences.
sure. Okay. So
So
diagnosis is supposed to help us get help for something, basically. If you're gonna identify a problem, well, now we can treat it. But some people just use it to like attack people, basically.
sure. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
And I think the bigger problem that happens is not so much that they attack people, but there's an assumption of understanding, right? So like your mom then thinks she knows what's wrong with you. And
Mhm.
by doing so, it's not so much that she's attacking you, although she can. It's also that they don't like actually listen to gamers' perspectives. So the big thing that is absent in all of the discussions on video game addiction are, so speaking of suicidality, I'll get messages from people that are like, I can't stop playing video games. I don't know what to do with my life. I'm stuck. I'm 27. I live at home and I want to kill myself.
Mhm.
I also get messages that are, I'll be browsing Reddit. I mean, I don't get, and I'll see these stories of like, if it wasn't for you guys, I would have killed myself years ago.
Mhm.
So I think video games and the gaming community can be an amazing source of support and growth. And it can be something that is like toxic and harmful.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, you don't really think about, I mean, you can actually, but generally speaking, we don't think about like the community of heroin users as like a place that can like support and bolster each other. When in reality they do. Like that's why NA and AA are powerful organizations.
Sure.
Um,
Mhm.
but gaming I think is a little bit different. There's no like there's esports, but there's no like professional heroin tournaments. So I think that the two
Sure.
are just different.
Sure.
And one last kind of nuance I'll toss out, which is like a good example of why I think that old patterns don't apply, is if there's a kid who spends, all day, every day practicing basketball and he's 16, then do you call him addicted because he wants to make it in the NBA? And when you've got a 16-year-old who's in the top 0.001% of a particular sport and wants to go pro and is
Mhm.
failing out of his classes, do you call him addicted? So it's tricky.
Yeah,
I,
for sure. I think it's really interesting. A lot of there's like two different types of like movies that show success in like sports or the arts or whatever. You have the like the very happy upbeat sports movies that like everybody's like super happy and super awesome the entire time, and then they win the championship and it's awesome. And then you have the others that show basically like the level of self-destruction that some people engage in to reach that top 0.0001%, where the difference between it being pathologized or not is whether or not they make it, basically.
Yep, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So like I have some clients who are, let's say, in investment banking,
Mm-hmm.
been divorced 3 times, have very high net worths, devote themselves body, mind, and soul
Mm-hmm.
to their profession. And how is that different from an esports professional or someone who wants to make it in esports?
Yeah.
So I think that our perceptions of health, wellness, and illness like need to be re-examined. That's another big thing I've learned. Is yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. Well, so if we're expanding the conversation, I have a lot of just interesting general questions for your perspective
Sure.
on what you just said. So when it comes to things like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD and the different subtypes or whatever, how do you let's say that there's like a healthy section of human mind that exists on a spectrum of 0 to 100, but let's say like in the society that we live in today, it seems like only like 20 to 80 work, right? And 0 to 20 is left out, 80 to 100 is left out. Is there ever a worry that we just pathologize those because they don't work with current society, rather than like having a more honest look at whether or not these are like unhealthy states of mind? So I'm thinking of something like specific to like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, usually the ones I hear people bring up the most, where these people aren't like mentally ill or they don't have a disease. It's just that with the way that we've organized society today, their minds specifically have a hard time adapting. Do you think, is that ever a big worry, do you think, in psychology with how we approach? Yeah.
That's half of what I preach about Ayurveda. So let me tell
Mm-hmm.
you the crux of the problem, Destiny, is that we think about it as a bell curve with one dimension.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the whole thing about Ayurveda, and this is, I think, a fundamental problem with our understanding of psychology and
Yeah.
medicine in general, is we
Wait, can you
assume,
repeat that again? The whole problem with what is that word you're using?
I forget, is the bell curve.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
It's one
I thought I heard you say
dimensional,
that. Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So
Okay.
we think about human mind as like a function on one dimension.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how the mind works. The mind is multidimensional. That's the
Mm-hmm.
first problem. So
Yeah.
you have
Oh,
like, okay,
Ayurveda is the word you use.
oh yeah, Ayurveda.
What is
So,
that?
so Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine.
Okay.
And Ayurveda posits that not, so this, I know this is going to sound kind of weird, but in
No
Western
problem.
medicine, we posit that all minds are basically the same,
Okay.
right? So like you go to psychology, like you major in psychology and you learn like principles of the mind. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
become a doctor, you learn like cardiac physiology, right? So which is like all hearts basically function the same way. And even when we're taught
Mm-hmm.
about the mind, we sort of learn that all minds basically function the same way. We have a subconscious, we have a conscious, we have an ego, we have an id, we have a superego. These are all commonalities of all minds, and we sort of treat them all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Ayurveda starts with the idea that not all minds are the same and not all people are the same, that
Okay.
people are unique. And they actually have 3 axes of like mind, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
can have scores on each of those axes. And depending on what your scores are on each of these 3 axes, you get sort of a unique mind. And
Okay.
I'll give you just an example. So, what we call ADHD is people who have high vata. So, I'm someone who has a high vata.
Okay.
So, vata is the Sanskrit word which sort of means wind and ether. So, my mind is like the wind. An Ayurvedic doctor once explained this to me. So, actually, I'll tell you the story. Can I go off on
Okay.
a tangent? This is what vatas do:
All the
is we
tangents you want. Yeah.
we
Go for it.
go we go off on tangents.
Okay.
So, I
I feel like you're
was
using your diagnosis as an excuse for irresponsible behavior, but I'm just messing with
absolutely.
you. Go ahead.
It's
No, no, go for it. You're
absolutely.
fine.
So
I'm
it
just
I
messing.
use it as an excuse for my irresponsible behavior, and I
Mm-hmm.
also use it as a key reason for why I believe I'm successful. It's
Sure.
both.
Okay. Hit me up with your story.
So I finished high school, went to college, started failing out, got super excited. So I like ran for student government. I joined a bunch of clubs. I went to a bunch of parties. I studied 3 languages in my first year in college because I got
Mm-hmm.
really excited about a bunch of shit. I was pre-med. I took philosophy courses. Like I was all over the place.
Sure.
Tried to join a fraternity, and failed. Like got mostly D's and F's, maybe a C or a B here or there. And then second year, what happened is like I tried to cut down. So like I cut down in my second semester, cut down in first semester of sophomore year, cut down, cut down, cut down. And then even like I was taking like 3 classes, which is half a normal load,
Mm-hmm.
and then was not doing any extracurriculars, was doing nothing, just taking, I was like a half-time student and nothing else. And I still did bad. And I went to India, and one of my teachers there, I was kind of telling him, I was like, I don't know why I suck at life. Like at first I was doing too many things and I understood that. And my dad was like, you got to focus, you got to focus, you got to focus. So I started doing fewer things and I started doing fewer things and I started doing fewer things. And despite like doing less stuff, I still continued to fail at basically the same rate. And I was just fucking confused.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, yeah, that sounds like a terrible idea. And I was like, what do you mean it's a terrible idea? And he's like, your mind is so dynamic that if you're going to get bored easily. And what you need to do is juggle as many balls as you can at the same time without dropping a single one. And that your mind is designed to like do something really, really passionately for a brief period of time and then switch to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, your best productivity is not going to come from one thing. It's going to come from like rotating your attention between like 3 or 4 different things. So when I get bored of one thing, I move to another. And I get bored of that, I move to that. This is the key thing that I didn't understand, is that I used to just keep on shifting A to Z. And the one change that I made is I just circled between A and D. And then I circled back to A. And that's when I started becoming like successful. But my mind is different. It's a Vata mind. And different kinds of minds need different sorts of strategies. And ADHD is a good example of like what I call, another dichotomy is like there are hunters and there are farmers. Like if you look at human psychology, some people excel at waking up the same time every day and doing the same thing every day. And they find a lot of pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, and ease in like putting all their energy into one thing. Those are farmers. And there are hunters who our brains are actually designed to pull in a lot of disparate stimuli and like piece things together. We have to be dynamic. It's absolutely adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
And ADD, I think, is a good example of some kinds of minds that are not ideally designed, which I think is what your question was, for things like sitting in a classroom for 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're made for. And so we get diagnosed with something because, it's like our mind is not designed to function that way.
Sure.
Was that too much?
No, it's interesting. It's something that my son is really, really, really bad ADHD. And that's kind of because I did like so much reading on it. And everything. I think I might even actually after doing so much research on it. But yeah, it's one of the things that I kind of wonder is like we're quick to pathologize behaviors that just don't fit into society.
Yep.
Yeah, it's very hard. When I talk publicly about anything related to like psychology or mental illness, you have to walk a very careful line between saying like, yeah, these are some concerns versus invalidating the whole field and like discouraging people from like seeking treatment or talking to professionals. Is a really hard conversation to have sometimes.
Yeah.
Because some people will take like, if you say like, oh yeah, we pathologize too much, some people are liable to take that and go, yeah, I knew it. Like it's all quack science. It's all bullshit. Like I'm not going to go talk to anybody. Like I don't need a pill or whatever. And then they just, walk away from everything, which is really bad, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some interesting data to support. So I think ADHD is a real thing for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think it's probably like way overdiagnosed. So
Sure.
there's data that suggests that student to teacher ratio has a pretty tight correlation with diagnosis of ADHD. Can you
That's not
predict
surprising.
what would be your guess as to what as the number of students per teacher goes up, what happens to ADHD diagnosis?
Diagnoses would probably increase.
Absolutely. And that's what you find. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. You have less time to spend per child. So your band of acceptable attention decreases and decreases. The more children you have, the more narrow their focus needs to be because the less time you can commit to them. So the higher likelihood that their behavior is pathologized and diagnosed as ADHD probably. Yeah.
It's exactly what the data shows.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Something else you brought up. If you ever want to go off on any of these two, just because
Sure.
I'm just asking questions. A lot of streamers have a problem where you get a message. Well, I say problem. That's a really rude way to say it. You get a lot of messages sometimes. People saying like, "Hey, like I'm suicidal. I don't really know what to do. I don't expect you to respond, but I just want to let you know my thoughts." Um, what do you think is a responsible course of action for, I guess, like streamers there in that? Yeah, yeah. What is a responsible course of action there for any streamer that gets a message like that?
I mean, so I think you should urge them to get help, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, it's cool. So many things I've learned, Destiny, since I started streaming on Twitch. One is like how awesome of a community this is in general,
Hmm.
and how tight the bonds are between a streamer and the audience, which is
Hmm.
really cool. I mean, I think it's actually, I was talking about this, I think maybe on that podcast, that I think it's kind of neat because, we're facing a lot of societal pressures in terms of mental health. And I
Hmm.
think that the very things that on the one hand are toxic are also the things that I hope to be our salvation. And like social media, I think is a good example of something that can be very harmful and also be like incredibly helpful.
Hmm.
In terms of what to do for a person who reaches out, like I think that it's hard because what do you have the bandwidth for, and what do you have the competence for?
Hmm.
And so I think it's important, if a someone reached out to you and said, "Hey, um, I have blood in my stool for the last 2 months," like what do you think your responsibility is as a streamer?
We tell them to see a doctor.
Yeah, so I think it's the same,
Hmm.
right? So I think that, like I was saying earlier, so I think we treat physical and mental illnesses still differently.
Hmm.
And I think that that person deserves the possibility of treatment if they do have an illness. And if not, even if they don't have an illness and they're like half the people that I see that are not suicidal, I think those people can be helped.
Hmm.
And, I think you just have to decide in terms of your own personal bandwidth and what you feel comfortable with, how much of a conversation to engage with them. And I
Sure.
think that the tricky thing there is that sometimes, if you really don't have, I think it can be unfair to people. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be careful about, because we think about this a lot on stream. Like when someone comes on stream, like what's our ongoing responsibility to them? So I think
Hmm.
it can be, you should do what you can. And then also, if you can't do the second step, give people direction as to how to do it.
Hmm.
Right? Like if you're a taxi driver and you take someone to a railway station or something and you drop them off, and then you're like, oh, yeah, so like your terminal is this way. Like you at least point them in the right direction.
Sure. Okay.
What do you
Do
think?
you ever um
How do you respond to those requests?
oh, I mean, yeah, I usually, because I get enough of it to where basically my response is, listen, I understand you're going through some things. Unfortunately, I don't have enough information to help you, and I don't think I would even have the time to give you the proper attention you need. I highly
Yeah.
recommend talking to either school resources or it's the psychologist, something, basically something like that. Yeah.
How does that feel to do?
Uh, I I'm sorry. I mean, personally, it's not. I don't think about it much, but I know that a lot of other streamers have like really big problems with that. Sorry, it sounds really cool to say, but I don't think I have like obligations to strangers that email me or whatever. I don't mean that to sound that cold, but yeah, I
Yeah.
don't personally think about it much. But I know that a lot of streamers have a lot of big problems where
Mhm.
when they get messages like that, they feel like they all of a sudden have like an obligation to a stranger to ensure that they have a positive outcome with their issues. And yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever worry about well, you use that phrase, what is our responsibility? Do you ever worry about people that you bring on seeing this as a sort of replacement for therapy? I
Sure.
know that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we try to, be clear with people before they come on.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't mean just from like a medical legal perspective. Like we genuinely try to make it clear to people. We try to equip people with further resources if they're interested. Like if they
Mhm.
want to explore things, I'll oftentimes tell them that I think you should continue working on this with a therapist.
Mhm.
Um, and generally speaking, sometimes people have misunderstood, and so we have clarifying conversations, and we try to behave sort of in the best and most ethical manner possible.
Mhm.
I tend to be kind of a stickler for like boundaries and ethics and stuff. I think it's a really fascinating field, especially in mental health.
Hmm.
Um, so we try to really do well as an organization to like really help them. And yeah, it's just sort of a case by case basis, though. I mean, we have sort of a set of resources and stuff that we provide to people, but
Sure. Okay, cool. Uh, when it comes to looking at mental health in the West, it feels like we talk a lot about body health, but it seems like we spend basically no time, at least through all of schooling, um, talking about not just not being mentally ill, but being mentally like very healthy. It seems like we don't value the pursuit of happiness very much in the Western world. I know a lot of people, and I'm sure you've met a lot of people in the streaming world or in the work world who their lives kind of revolve around the acquisition of bigger houses, higher paying jobs, maybe different items or possessions. What kind of conversation do you have with somebody to start to get them down the track of thinking that they should prioritize for things that give them like more sustained or longer term happiness than just kind of like getting stuck in like the race of trying to get more and more stuff or like a higher wage? Does that question make sense?
yeah. So I think so. I mean, how do you deviate people from being materialistically oriented?
Yeah, I guess this is like I view this as being like one of the biggest problems that I think that most people that I talk to face is that we have like no concept of like when we think of like progress of society or lives, nobody ever thinks like, man, when I was 20, I could have like three close friends. Now that I'm 35, I can have like 15 close friends. Like nobody, it seems like nobody would ever say something like that and view it as progress. But rather, when I was 20, I was making 45 a year. Now that I'm 35, I'm making 120. Like that's the progress of people thinking. Well, how do you talk to somebody or how do you begin to set somebody on the path of not viewing life like that? It's a really hard one. Sorry.
No, I think I mean, that's a lot of my day job. So let me start by
Hmm.
saying, you had some context at the beginning. So let me start with that context.
Sure.
So I would disagree that we don't think about happiness. It's just the way we think about happiness and the way that we're taught to think about happiness is materialistic.
Hmm.
So these are
Yeah.
cultural values, right? So
Yeah.
like when you meet like a kid who's like 14, the first question that people ask is, what do you want to be when you grow up?
You grow up. Yeah.
So right then and there, a whole society is teaching an individual that your identity is based on your profession.
Hmm.
So why would that individual not orient towards a profession first and foremost? What
Hmm.
are the things that we celebrate? Oh, like getting into Harvard, like getting a promotion, getting a raise. These are the things as a society that we celebrate. We don't advertise, hey, I met a friend today. It's like, okay, like the fuck is wrong with you where you have to like advertise making a friend? So our
Yeah.
value system is, I mean, we just think that something leads to happiness.
Hmm.
And, uh, that too, I don't think is entirely unfair because, I'm a second generation Indian where, my parents, like happiness, like sort of spiritual fulfillment was like really not a thing that anyone had the luxury for because, my dad grew up in a house that had like 8 people living in a 10 by 10 space. So it's really about, like making ends meet. Like my grandfather was like heavily in debt. My parents like borrowed money for a plane ticket and suitcases when they came to this country.
Hmm.
And so I think a lot of that is kind of, it's, I don't really blame the society for what it is, but I think your question is a good one, which actually kind of comes back to, how do you reorient people? So I do reorient people because most of my, at least until about, I started doing Healthy Gamer more, most of my patients or clients would be successful, like professionally successful people who are unhappy. That
Hmm.
was sort of what I was good at. And what I tell them is that, this is actually the same problem that Buddha faced. So, and this is kind of subtle, but so, Buddha had everything. So he was a prince and he was loved and had wealth and power and respect. And then one day he woke up and he was unhappy.
Hmm.
And then he was like, I don't understand like why I'm unhappy. And something very subtle happens. So this is another thing that happens. We tend to do a lot of gatekeeping around suffering. So we don't let
Yes.
people who are successful suffer. We blame them for
Hmm.
suffering. And we say that you shouldn't suffer because you have money or success or whatever. Another common
Yeah,
thing that I
that's a
see
big
with
thing. Yeah, I bring this up a lot around streamers is that like if you're a streamer, you can't ever really complain about anything related to your job publicly because you sound so unbelievably entitled. Like, oh, boohoo, you're getting hate because you're famous. Wow. Oh my God. It's so like people generally in the public perceive it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the basic question is, what do you think is the source of suffering? And does
Hmm.
money buy happiness? And money does correlate with happiness to a certain degree, right? It
Hmm.
certainly provides security. But the
I think up
really,
to like
really,
70 to 80K. Yeah.
yeah. So the really fascinating thing, though, is if you look at Buddha, so like here's what happens. Like, so I think basically, how you talk to them is they need spirituality. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. So if you think
Hmm.
about it, let's say I make 30K a year and I've never dated anyone in my life and I'm unhappy. So when I look at my
Hmm.
life, I think, okay, in order to be happy, I need a girlfriend. So let's say I get a girlfriend and my happiness increases some. And then I'm like, okay,
Hmm.
now I want more money. And so you make more money and then happiness increases some because it does, right? You get to travel and like, oh, I got to go to Hawaii because now I'm making 50K instead of 30K and I can afford to make a vacation. Sure.
Hmm.
And so what happened with Buddha is like he checked all those boxes. And as long as you have a box unchecked, you think that checking those boxes is going to lead to happiness, which is not
Hmm.
an unreasonable way to think. But what happened with Buddha is he gets to the end of the road and he's checked all the boxes and then he wakes up and he's happy. And then he's screwed. Because then what does he do?
Hmm.
And so this is where, like, when I work with people who are materialistic or materialistically successful and unhappy, I basically tell them, now you're on Buddha's path. And there's a saying sort of in the meditation community that you can't meditate on an empty stomach.
Hmm.
You can also see this, shades of this in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he says self-actualization is at the top, right?
Yeah.
You have to
Wealth
take care of
creates
you.
the conditions to pursue happiness, not happiness itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think from a more psychological or spiritual aspect, there is this idea because
Hmm.
our brains tell us that external stuff will lead to satisfaction, and once you
Hmm.
satisfy yourself externally, that's really when you have the desperation that is
Hmm.
really required for true spirituality. Like
Sure.
people talk about spirituality like it's a good thing, but in my experience, true spirituality is born of like abject desperation and terror.
Okay.
It's when nothing else in the world will work for you. You only have one option left. And that's really what it takes.
Gotcha. I don't know how common it is among immigrant families in the United States, but in my personal experience, sometimes the new immigrants to the U.S. are some of the most like ultra liberal, very patriotic, very individualized people. And I noticed that for my family on my mom's side is all Cuban, and they are obsessed. My mom and her siblings are obsessed with acquisition of material wealth. So like they have huge houses, but like they all work multiple jobs. They're like even with their full retirements and pensions where they're trying to like keep up their payments or whatever. And it just seems pretty miserable. And then I think back to I have older Cuban family that live down in Miami in a place called Hialeah. Very trashy, cockroaches everywhere. Water is like flooding the apartment every single time it rains. Horrible place. But when I would spend the summer there, almost every other day, there were like these huge cookouts where like everybody was going, everybody's laughing, everybody's having a good time. And even though they were completely missing that material level of wealth, it seemed like they were all like super friendly, really happy, like really chill with everybody. Um, and watching that dichotomy between like the ultra wealthy, super liberal, individualistic American that has the big house and the dream cars or whatever, versus like the very poor people, it seems strange to think that like my older family just seemed to be more happy in general, I guess, when they weren't like running that. Yeah,
How
but
do you
it's been
understand that?
impossible to talk or what.
How do you understand that?
Um, how do I understand it in like why do I think what drives
Yeah.
each person to
I
do?
mean, how do you understand that phenomenon?
um broader. This is a broader philosophical, I guess, understanding I have. It feels like in the Western world in general, it feels like we very much fixate on possession and money. So a lot of parents, when they talk about, I want my child to have a better life than me. Most of the time, what that translates to is, I want my child to have a better job and make more money than me. And I feel like my mom's parents were very much like, we came from Cuba to the United States to give our children better lives, and they all, my mom joined the Air Force, my aunt was in the NYPD. Like people got jobs and they got money, but they never, maybe they just assumed that like those values of like friends and family would filter down automatically. but they didn't actually deliberately instill them. So my parents got the whole like, yeah, like you guys can do better than us. You can be successful. You can have good jobs and make a lot of money. But they didn't actually stress those, I guess, like friendship values or the relationships you can form with other people. And those didn't filter down as much. That would be like my assumption, I guess.
Why don't you think they filter down as much?
Why don't they filter down? Um, I think maybe there are some things that filter down unconsciously, and other things require some deliberate level of filtering down. So, for instance, like if you're abusive to your children, that type of modeling might filter down automatically. But if you have some value of, I guess in this case of like forming friendships with other people, if that's not as visible to your children, maybe they take it for granted or it doesn't filter down as much. Maybe there's some things that filter automatically and some things that don't. I'm not sure. Yeah, that would be my guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, for a lot of it, I mean, I agree with you in terms of some stuff is explicitly filtered down, but I think
Hmm.
that, generally speaking, I almost think about it like Darwin's finches. So there's a particular mindset that is adaptive for a
Hmm.
particular circumstance. And, I know at least in my parents' circumstance, like friendships were not as important as like paying off the crushing debt of your family.
Yeah.
And so they
Hmm.
oriented towards like materialistic success, which is, I mean, I consider myself to be quite lucky because I think they also instilled in me, they weren't materialistic, they were very successful. But I
Hmm.
remember, being 16 years old and then like, my parents asked me, they're like, do you, what kind of car do you want? Because I could
Hmm.
have had a car. And I was like, oh, I don't need one. And because I had friends, I was younger, I started school earlier, skipped a grade or whatever. And so my
Hmm.
friends drove. So like a year before, I would always get rides. And like I didn't even get a driver's license till I was 18, which on the one hand is like super entitled and privileged. And on the other hand is also like quite unmaterialistic. It's kind of weird, right? It's sort of like both.
Sure.
Whereas
Depending. Well, it depends on where you live, but I understand what you mean. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of like my friends were really shocked that I had the option of having a car and I chose not to take it,
Hmm.
which is like the depth of materialistic, but it was also like my parents also instilled in me values that stuff doesn't bring happiness. And so
That's really good. Yeah.
I'm lucky that way.
Hmm.
Um,
The thing you brought up earlier about jobs is really interesting. When you like, there's a weird transition that happens at some point. I think maybe in high school, where when you ask a kid when he's a child, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" It seems like a really positive experience to look forward to because I want to be like an astronaut or a firefighter. Like these are like, what are your passions? And then by the time they hit like maybe it's like 14, 15 when they get to high school, now it's like, what kind of job do you want to have when you graduate college? It's a much, much different question that is like you're reframing something earlier in a more negative light, it seems. But yeah.
yeah, so I mean, the reason that I was pre-med in college is because when I told my parents' friends when I
Hmm.
was 17 years old at a Christmas party that I want to be a doctor one day,
Hmm.
they like thought I was the hottest shit in the world. They were like, "Wow." And then I was like, I felt really good, right? I was like, I'm gonna be a doctor one day.
Hmm.
And so you start to develop this professional based ego. And it's like the absolute worst reason to become a doctor. And it's why half of the Indian kids that I know become doctors.
Sure.
And but I mean, I don't blame people for doing that. I think it's like, we pass on to our kids the formula for success that we think is important.
Hmm.
So in our case, we may emphasize friendships and happiness to the detriment of professional success.
Which I think is okay, but I guess it would depend on the person you talk to. I think most
Right?
people would think that's okay if they'd experienced both ends of it, but yeah.
Yeah, right. So our parents also thought it was okay to sacrifice friendships for the sake of professional security.
Mhm.
Right? That's why they did it.
Have you ever seen on the internet, the kind of hyper obsession with STEM and the kind of relentless shitting on, like, the arts and humanities and
Sure.
stuff? Is that yeah.
I mean, I work. I don't know if you're familiar with some of these prep schools, but I've had patients or clients at these prep schools, and it's like one of the biggest crises of confidence
Mhm.
for a 15 or 16-year-old girl at a place like Phillips Exeter is discovering that they don't want to do STEM.
Mhm.
It's so hard because they've been taught, oh, like there need to be more women in medicine and women in engineering, and they want to be like astrophysicists. And there's almost this like bizarre pressure that's placed upon them that because it's a male dominated field, they should seek to like even that out. Whereas like really they just sometimes they just don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely see that pressure. I think some of it's fair in terms of like discrimination and stuff like that, but
Can't swing too far in the other direction. Yeah.
yeah, I think those fields are overvalued in general. So like those are the feeling like if you're a second generation immigrant. When I was growing up, yeah, I had a couple of options. My dad
Mm-hmm.
said to us once, one of y'all is going to be a doctor and one of y'all is going to be a lawyer. I have an elder brother. And what I used to say in my med school interviews when they were like, why do you want to become a doctor? I said, well, when I was growing up, my dad said one of y'all is going to be a doctor and one of y'all is going to be a lawyer. My
You didn't
brother
want to
was
be a lawyer.
older
Yeah.
and he chose law school, so that's why I'm here.
What do you think? Do you think you just got lucky then, or do you think that you learned to like accept your profession, or why do you think you ended up enjoying what you do? I assume you enjoy what you do. You seem
I
like you
love
do.
what I do.
Uh huh.
So I mean, I think so. My story is kind of interesting. So I started out pre med, but I really wasn't really interested in being a doctor. I actually became interested in being a doctor about a couple years after truly became interested in being a doctor, about 2 or 3 years after I finished college. And what I realized it was actually part of more of my spiritual path more
Mm-hmm.
than anything else. And then now I think a lot about karma and things like that. And I think I'm supposed to be a doctor. But um, for me, the decision really changed when so I tried to become a monk. So I tried to like give up my material life, and my teachers said, "You're welcome to do that, but you have to get a doctoral degree, and you have to make that choice when you're 30."
Mm-hmm.
Which is really smart of them because at the age of 21, I wasn't really giving up anything. I had nothing worth giving up. If you really want to
Mm-hmm.
become a monk, you have to give shit up, and that means building shit and then walking away. Right. And this is what I see a lot in like also sort of these like pseudo spiritual people who are like myself, 21, anti establishment, believe that the capitalist world is terrible and they don't want to participate in it and that they're going to devote themselves to spirituality and they're not like really giving up anything.
Mm-hmm.
They're just saying no to the system because they don't want to play that game.
Yeah.
And so my teachers were like, go complete your education. And one of my teachers was a neuroscientist, a PhD in neuroscience. Another one had a PhD in quantum physics. And these were like the two monks basically that I learned a lot from, or I've had a couple of other people, but um,
Mm-hmm.
and they said, go finish your education, and then if you're interested when you're 30, we'll take you. One of my other teachers said, if you can't actually like succeed in the material world, you're not going to succeed in the spiritual world because materialistic success is easier than spiritual success.
Sure.
And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to just pick something arbitrary. I might as well become a doctor. At the least, I'll understand about like the physical body, which I think will help me when I become a monk. So I decided, okay, I just said it almost arbitrarily. I was like, I'm just going to become a doctor because that's what I'm going to do. After I finish medical school and stuff like that, I'm going to walk away and I'm going to go be a monk. And that's really when I decided to become a doctor and gave it my all.
Gotcha.
I don't know
Do
if
you
that
have
answers
a?
your question.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think it makes sense. It seems like you had you. I think this sometimes. It seems like sometimes we get really really lucky that we stumble into certain people in our lives rather than somebody that could have, um, I guess, put you down another path. I don't know too much about people in this world of spirituality, but it seems like it's possible that you could have wound up with somebody that would have just encouraged you wholeheartedly to drop school and just to pursue the giving up everything lifestyle, and that would have turned out not as good for you. It seems.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were people who encouraged me for that. There were people who
Hmm.
encouraged me. So I applied to medical school for 3 years because it's hard to get into med school with a 2.5 GPA. And
Sure.
I got like what I think at the end of 2 years, I had gotten 90 rejections.
Hmm.
And, even people who were really close to me advised for me other paths. They were like, hey, man, you maybe want to think about doing something else.
Uh-huh.
And that's why I say like that's when I really decided to become a doctor because it was a bad idea to continue. Like objectively, it was bad.
Hmm.
And I had other options, like I could have gone to the Caribbean and places like that. But I was like, unless I can succeed at this, I'm not going to succeed at being a monk. So I'm going to keep going. To hell with the
Okay.
odds. Now,
When you do your, or go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. I
Or
mean,
it was going to be a question.
you'd asked I think you'd brought up this point about like, you're kind of lucky that there are some people in your life, and I completely agree. And I think a lot about karma, which is something that I've really come to appreciate and respect more and more. So I don't really
Gotcha.
think about it as luck, but
Okay. Do oh, oof. Okay, hold on. Because
yeah,
I have one question in terms of like
I wanted to toss that out just for you.
yeah, good. Yeah, because I want to hook onto that. Yeah, I have
Yeah.
a question about like how do you decide what level of spirituality to incorporate in your conversations with people, such that you feel like it won't turn them off from the conversation, and you feel like it's that's a secondary question. But now that you brought up the karma thing, so personally for me, I try to avoid any idea of like deserved circumstances, because I worry that it leads people down this road of thinking. So, for instance, if you bring up a concept of karma and you had a few awesome mentors, and well, that's the universe, working as it's intended to. What do you say then to like people that never found those figures in life? Like, do you ever worry that they might take that as like, oh man, I guess I either messed up hard in a previous life or I just did something bad in my youth to not earn, I guess, that mentor, like karma didn't pay off for me because I'm a failure. How do you balance that out, or yeah, how do you address
Yeah,
that?
that's a great question, and it's
Hmm.
hard. So this is a long conversation, if you'll permit me.
Yeah, of course, your time.
So
Yeah.
when I was studying in India, I was learning
Hmm.
about all this stuff. And karma was something that I sort of had I didn't believe in like destiny or fate or any of that stuff. I'm very scientific, like I'm very skeptical. So
Sure.
people would sort of talk about it. I was like, it just seems like randomness to me.
Hmm.
And that sentiment was even reinforced by like people that I would talk to, right? So I was somewhat skeptical. So I'd go to like different monks and different people who were studying, and I'd talk to them and be like, what do you think about karma? And the
Hmm.
most telling thing that made me feel like karma is complete bullshit is one person I talked to was like, don't tell anyone this. And this was a monk who was like, I don't believe in karma. I think it's bullshit. And I was
Hmm.
like, why do you say that? And he says, I have trouble accepting any system in which if someone gets raped, it's their fault.
Yeah. Or starving children, or cancer when you're
Right.
25, or any number of horrible
And I
things.
was like, that's a damn good point. So like I was like, okay, karma's out the window. And it was for like a decade for me because I could never resolve that. Like, why do bad things happen to good people? And people use karma as an explanation. And that I think is dumb. I think
Hmm.
it's absolutely dumb. And then I don't know when this happened, but at some point, like something clicked, probably through meditation. So I think this also gets into like where knowledge comes from. So I'd say that a lot of my understanding of karma doesn't come from logic because I think that stance logically is indefensible and I don't accept it. Like I'm not willing to believe in any system that says that if something bad happens to you, it's your fault.
Hmm.
Which there's problems with that too. But so I think that from a very good, I mean, you make a really strong point that people sort of say that I'm screwed because of my karma, which is what a lot of people in India do, and like Indians and Hindus. And
Hmm.
I find that to be bullshit. I think it's a very easy way to absolve yourself of all responsibility because it's sort of karma gets equated as destiny or fate, right?
Hmm.
But that's really not what karma is. And if you really stop and think about it, like here's my understanding of karma, it's nothing but Newton's third law, second law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's not a principle of destiny or fate, it's a principle of science. So the people who developed the theory of karma noticed that all actions have reactions, right? Like
Hmm.
if I drop a ball, it falls. And so
Yeah.
then they started asking themselves a really interesting question, which is like, where does that principle stop working? Right? So for earlier today, we were talking about why the values that we got instilled and why there are different groups of people. And
Hmm.
we came up with explanatory causes for the effects that we see. Materialistic family, fun loving family. And we said that this has a cause. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I understand where we're going. Yeah.
Right? So, like, physics is like a very clear cause. And
Hmm.
then we get to these things like psychology, which is like, eh. And then we get to shit like behavioral economics, which is like,
Hmm.
is there a cause and effect there? And
Hmm.
generally speaking, I think the answer is yes.
course, yeah. There has to be, right? Everything is causal, if we believe.
But hold on a second. So
Huh.
that's a very bold claim, right? Because if you say that everything is causal,
Mhm.
do you really mean everything is causal?
I do. I'm a hard determinist, yeah. I do
Okay.
believe
So
everything's
does
causal, yeah.
that mean that you were born to your particular parents? Is
Mhm.
that the effect of a cause?
Yep.
What's the cause?
The cause is them having sex,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
So do you so that explains the actual biological birth. What do you
Mhm.
think about like your sense of identity or personality? Is that also just purely based on the biology of your brain?
Yeah, your conscious mind is an emergent property of the underlying neurochemistry or whatever of the brain, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I disagree, right? So I think that like in my experience,
Mhm.
so this is the way that I think about people's lives. So like I think about let's say let's say I have a fence and I'm standing on one side of the fence
Mhm.
and I see a ball come over the fence and all I have is its downward trajectory. All that
Mhm.
is observable and scientifically verifiable is the downward trajectory.
Mhm.
Can I know where that ball came from?
Depends on how deep you're asking this question. I mean, the ball could have come from a whole other dimension. We don't know. We
Sure,
just see it come over the fence. Yeah. I mean,
reliably.
the assumption would be it came from the neighbor's yard, right?
Yep, and where in the neighbor's yard? Could I calculate its point of origin?
I mean, assuming you had perfect data about the way that the ball was falling, the arc
Yep,
of the angle and everything. Yes, you could. Yeah.
even though I have no scientifically verifiable or empirical observation about its origin.
I'm hesitant to concede that. I mean, I would argue that if you have the trajectory,
Ah, but
that you,
but that's
yeah.
all we have, right? All we
Mhm.
have is the effect. We don't have the cause.
Well, but if we understand the universe to be causal, then we would know that that one effect could only be preceded by one particular thing. It would necessitate an origin, right? It must have been launched at a particular speed and angle, right?
Yep.
Hmm.
Right. So I think this is where now the question becomes in terms of your experience as a conscious being,
Hmm.
is so like that's an effect. We both agree there. The question is, what is the cause? Is it simply neurons and consciousness?
Hmm.
And so then the question is like, do you think that your parents meeting was also like, was it random that they met, or was their relationship the effect of a prior cause?
Everything is the effect of a prior cause, basically. That's what I would say, right?
Right. So then we could assume, therefore, that
Hmm.
your consciousness and personality is the downstream effect of causes that happened before you were even born.
Correct. The beginning of the universe. Yeah.
Right. So the big difference between karma and science is karma presupposes that some of the things about your life today were
Hmm.
determined by things that happened before you were born.
Hmm.
And science so far generally says no, right? Science
That
says that
Wait, science says no, that things that are happening in your life today aren't due to things that happened before you were born.
not generally, right? So if you look at like psychology or behavioral economics,
Uh huh.
people don't think about causal factors before you were born in the application of our scientific understanding of an individual human being.
Is that really true though? So, like for instance, like for psychology, what if we look at things like or genetics, right? If you look at things like heredity, we can talk about the heritability of even political beliefs, right? Which would be
Beautiful,
like,
right?
yeah,
So
okay, yeah,
now
go.
this is interesting. So like let's look at
Hmm.
what traditionally karma has said and what science says now, because I think genetics is the first scientific evidence of the theory of karma. Because
Okay.
just think about this. We generally say that your life is like, determined by like stuff now and is not influenced by things from the past. That's how we look at our lives. And
Hmm.
genetics is the first scientific. So put yourself 200 years ago, right? So
Okay.
we can't think about ourselves now. And what if I told you that like who you are today is determined by things before you were born?
I mean, I would fully agree with that. I feel like the scientific evidence though tends to take that point of view that who you are today is usually an amalgamation of stuff that happened prior to your birth. So, for instance, are you born to a single parent household? What is the socioeconomic status of your family in the United States? Like, I would view those factors as being like majorly important in the formation of you as a person. Yeah, go.
Yeah. So we are today, but what I'm saying is like
Mhm.
put yourself 200 years ago before we had the discovery of genetics. Because like
Yeah.
generally speaking, science says like here is the now, and the past tends to be filled with randomness and may not be like associated with the now.
I mean, I don't agree with that, obviously, but
I mean, I don't. I mean, in the truest sense, science doesn't say that, right? Because we have Big Bang theory and we have gravity and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at the application of science and the theory of
Uh-huh.
karma, all of the theory of karma says is that there's stuff in prior to this birth that affects you
Hmm.
in this birth, and that's the idea of reincarnation, that you carry karma from your past life and stuff like that. All it's saying
Uh-huh.
is that there's stuff that's happened in the past, which sounds radical. If I were to tell you that destiny, things from your past life affect, for example, the fact that Nathan is your son,
Hmm.
what would you see?
Well, now I guess it's getting into what do we consider past life, I guess, or what do you mean by that? What prior causes are we talking about?
Exactly. Right. So
Uh-huh.
this is where the border. So karma used to be like super crazy. And the more that we learn in science, so this is the way that I kind of think about it. There's like
Hmm.
order in the universe and there's chaos. And
Hmm.
like 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, most of the universe was chaos and very little of it was order. The reason
Hmm.
that lightning happened was because of Zeus. There's a whimsical god in the sky who sometimes gets pissed off and throws lightning bolts at the ground. And
Okay.
then as our scientific increasing his understanding has grown, we've demystified a lot of stuff and we added order into our universe.
Hmm.
So at some point, the question is, this kind of comes back to, I'm lucky that there were certain influences in my life. Is there order to me meeting the people that I met? Is there an explanatory reason that we can deduce for why those people are in my life and other
Hmm.
people don't have those people? That was your original question. What do you think?
Yes, of course.
All right, so that's karma.
Okay. So the original contention, the original problem that I have is that my problem with karma is that usually, now maybe it's possible you don't view it this way, which is good if you don't. But the problem that I have with this is that karma often carries with it this idea of moral weight.
It's
Um
wrong.
what
Absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm saying that to 99% of people, without your explanation, karma to them will have a moral weight. So, for instance, like a wealthy person will see a poor person and think, well, that's karma. They earned their place in life and I earned my place in life, rather than viewing karma as like a billion antecedent causes that eventually led down to a chain of whatever they are today. I think I must, right? I must subscribe to your idea of karma, given the way you've explained it. It just feels like a lot of people view karma a lot differently than what your explanation would have
Yeah,
been.
so I mean, I tend to be somewhat arrogant,
Hmm.
but I think those people are wrong.
Sure.
Right. So I think that karma is not, and this is what I've like learned through meditation. So I think my understanding of karma doesn't come from like logic or reading,
Mhm,
it comes from meditation. And it comes from the realization that karma in its essence is no
mhm,
different from, I keep on forgetting which of Newton's laws it is, but that every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
uh-huh,
And that it's just the fundamental principle of cause and effect. That's what karma is. It's nothing more and nothing less. The only reason it sounds wild is because it presumes that some of the effects in this life come
mhm,
from things that are not observable by this person in his current state of consciousness.
gotcha. Okay,
But it has
okay,
no moral. So this is the other confusing thing. So karma doesn't truly have morality.
mhm,
We're the ones who. So what karma says is, this is also not a great way of putting it, but let's just concede it for a second. What goes around comes around. And so the reason
mhm,
that something bad happened to you is because you did something bad. We're the ones that
yeah,
place the value judgment, right? If I like hit myself in the face with a tennis racket, I'm the one who says that that's a bad thing because I place the value judgment. All karma says is that if you do A, then B will happen. It's
mhm,
just cause and effect. We're the ones who place the morality on top of it. The theory of karma has nothing to do with morality. It just
sure.
says you reap what you sow.
Yeah, I understand that. As people, though, humans moralize everything, so yeah, it can be kind of hard to address a concept like that. I guess like in a moral vacuum or whatever, because it seems like people are very quick to moralize everything. Literally, it's a frustration that I have, I guess.
Yeah, so
Um,
I'm quick to moralize as well, and that's dharma. Dharma,
okay,
right? So dharma and karma are linked. But karma isn't has nothing to do with morality. Dharma absolutely does.
gotcha. Okay. Um, I don't know how much time you have, so just tell me if you need to we
Half
need
an
to
hour?
take off. Okay. How do you decide how do you decide what level of spirituality to incorporate in your discussions with people? Or I imagine there must have been some point in your life when you were either in school or when you first started practicing, when you were like, "I'm going to be this spiritual," or "I'm not going to bring this up at all," or what? Like, what was that thought process like?
Yeah, so it's evolved over time. So it starts
Hmm.
with when I was applying to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
and having someone who was writing me a letter of recommendation strategize with me about how much to talk about complementary and alternative medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So like, we don't know how much we want you to talk about yoga, because like if you talk about yoga and Ayurveda, like they may not like that because they're going to think you're like hokey.
Sure.
And so I talked about it less. And then after, my third year that I applied, I was like, you know what, this is just who I am. It's a big part of who I am. So I'm going to talk about it. And if they like it, that's great. I don't want to wind up at a medical school where I have to like hide part of who I am. So that
Mm-hmm.
was like kind of the first step. And then at that point, I think complementary and alternative medicine was becoming like more evidence based. So this was back in 2008, 2009 ish.
Mm-hmm.
And so by then, like, people, like, there were yoga studios cropping up. People were really starting to do research. Um, and so that was kind of the first, because I think complementary and alternative medicine and spirituality in some ways go hand in hand. Um, and then during residency, so then, when I was applying after medical school, I focused on evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine because I still tend to be like pretty scientific and evidence-based. I'm not like a hokey, yoga hippie kind of dude. Like, I do yoga in a more rigorous, scientific, and calculated way.
Sure.
Um, and then in residency, it was interesting because I sort of basically didn't do much of it. And I had a couple of experiences where I was like sort of testing the waters. So I was being taught therapy, and so I started to like spread my wings a little bit and incorporate some Eastern philosophy, meditation, some of these concepts like karma, not karma because that's like really unscientific, but I
Sure.
started to spread my wings a little bit, and then actually found that, um, got some negative pushback from some people. So one of my therapy supervisors, so when you're training to become a psychiatrist, you have supervisors who like supervise you in therapy. So I go and I do therapy with my patients, and then you go and you talk to your therapy supervisor, and sometimes they sit in and they watch you do therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my therapy supervisors said, I don't know if I can supervise you because I don't know what you're doing, but it's not therapy. And I was kind of taken aback, and I was like, I'm not sure what you mean. And then she was saying, like, yeah, like you're doing something, but it's not therapy. Like, it seems helpful. So I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked to my program and stuff about that, and they were like, thankfully, they were pretty supportive, and they're like, yeah. So this is, I think, the first time that I'd ever heard of this happening, where sometimes, residents will complain about their supervisors. That happens all the time because we tend to be like a fickle and bitchy little bunch.
Sure.
But it's rare that, like, it's common that you'll have students complain to a teacher. I mean, complain about teachers. It's very rare to have a teacher. Well, maybe not that rare, but it's less common for a teacher to say, I can't have this student in my class anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Especially when you're like a resident. So it's not like, kids with behavioral problems when they're 8, but we
Yeah.
tend to be like well-functioning human beings. And so thankfully my program found me sort of a different supervisor who was more comfortable with me kind of doing my own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, I sort of dabbled into the waters. And what I tended to find, which is weird, is that the more I included spirituality, like the better my patients got. And that too is, I don't necessarily think it's because I'm that much better of a psychiatrist, but I think people would come to me with these issues like, I lack happiness in my life. And that's not the same as having major depressive disorder.
Sure.
So over time, I've included more and more spirituality in general. Like on Twitch, I was never planning on talking about spirituality. I thought I would be eaten alive
Mm-hmm.
by Twitch. When I started streaming on Twitch, I had an army of scientific articles to back up why I think meditation and yoga is good.
Mm-hmm.
Like all kinds of stuff, like even chanting. Why chanting? Because it's such a strange meditation technique. The scientific evidence behind why I recommend chanting.
Mm-hmm.
So for all of the practices that I do, I had like all this science. And what I was stunned is that what people ask me about is not neuroscience. People ask me about is dharma. How do I find my dharma? How do I
Yeah.
find purpose? How do I find meaning?
People identify with like stories and narratives way more than 52% of 72% of whatever scientific article generally is what I find.
I think that's actually an unfair characterization because I don't think that story or narrative is what I talk about in terms of dharma. So I don't think that one is just a story and the other isn't. Like I
Sure,
think
I'm
the
sorry.
two
That
are.
sounds really, yeah, I don't mean to sound dismissive. When I say story or narrative, what I mean is it like something that you can tell somebody that they can like emotionally hook into, and like personally identify or empathize with is going to stick with somebody's mind way more than being read like some numbers off of a study is kind of the way that I view it.
Yeah, but when I read numbers off of a study, it's
Mhm.
emotionally, it sinks in too.
Okay. I find that experience seems to not be the case as much. That let's say for instance,
Yeah, so
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you that that's not the case as much.
Mhm.
But when I cite studies, I do so in the same way that I cite spirituality, which is in theme with my general narrative.
Sure. Okay. So
Right?
it's
So
like
I
a
agree that studies are drier, but like that's why like when you cite a study, you have to do it at the right time and that it
yeah.
gives you oomph to the story. I just thought that I would be citing way more studies than scriptures when I
Gotcha.
was adding oomph to my points. And what Twitch seems to be more interested in actually is like spirituality, which doesn't mean that they're not interested in the science. But anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just, there was
Oh
something
yeah,
about
no,
that
for sure.
premise which I didn't feel was fair.
Sure. Okay. Do you for one of the big complaints that I hear about people that are pursuing like mental health related stuff is that there's a very brutal game of trying to find the right therapist. So either somebody that you feel like understands you or doesn't judge you or is empathizing with you in a way that like I guess like rings or resonates with you more. How do you suggest two questions on this? How do you suggest somebody? It sounds bad, but like shops for a therapist. Like, what's the best way to find a therapist? And then, how can you tell when you have a therapist that is challenging you appropriately versus somebody that you just like don't click with at all? Yeah.
Great question. So, first question is how do you shop for a therapist? So, what I recommend that people do, so there are resource concerns about this, right? So, that has to be taken into account. But what I
Yeah.
recommend that people do is make appointments with three different therapists
Hmm.
and you pick the one that like whose webpage you like the most.
Hmm.
What is going on? I'm
Okay.
confused by Twitch chat. Sorry.
Oh,
I
your
should
chat
I
just
should
got
probably.
turned off with sub mode, so
Okay.
everybody's free again.
Okay, I'm going to just minimize that because it's distracting.
Okay.
Um but so I was like, "Oh, freedom." And
Yeah.
I thought we were talking about how to find a therapist and I was like really confused.
Oh.
Um but so I'd say like make three appointments and pick your top choice first because therapy is about fit.
Hmm.
And then, I'd space them out by like 2 weeks. And when you find someone that like at the end of the session, if you feel like you can talk to them and they kind of get you,
Hmm.
if it feels good to you, then cancel the others. And then or C3 and then pick the one that you fit the best with. Now, how do you know if you're being appropriately challenged? So I think the main thing that people need to understand about therapy is that if you have a problem in therapy,
Hmm.
unlike pretty much any other place, it's the one place where you can go and you can just tell your therapist that you have a problem with them.
Hmm.
You can walk in and you can say, I feel like this is a fucking waste of my time and I feel like you're just taking my fucking money. And as a therapist, when people do that, I'm like, awesome. Good. And give your therapist the benefit of understanding your difficulty and letting them work on it. Like if you have a problem with a therapist, tell them. Don't I think I'm a man and you're a woman, and I don't think you can ever understand what my experience as a man is like in this world. I
Hmm.
don't think that seeing you is going to mean anything. Like, I'm not going to get anything out of this. Just go to your therapist and tell them that. Because I think the big thing that people don't understand is they think that a therapist like has a good fit. I mean, so I tell you to find a fit, but I think the main thing that you need to understand about therapy is that like in order for therapy to work, the two of you have to work together at solving your problem. And if your first problem is that you don't fit, that's the thing that you guys need to solve. How can you guys make it so that the two of you fit?
Hmm.
And the patients that I tend to find the most frustrating are the ones that don't tell me what's wrong.
They're hiding thoughts because they think you won't understand, or they just don't trust, I guess,
Whatever.
your judgment, whatever. Yeah.
And like one, anyway, yeah. So I've had some experiences where then they'll because they like me, so that you
Mhm.
don't want to criticize someone, and they're like, I didn't want to say like, you know, this hurt my feelings. Like, you got to tell me, man.
Mhm. Well, if you have a friend that is struggling with mental illness, in terms of how you view the normal population, what are a couple ways that you can be supportive to that person that you feel like a lot of people miss? I caught you talking about using reflective language, for instance, instead of invalidating somebody's feelings. That seemed like a really helpful tip. Do you have any other like things like that where it's like when somebody hears this from a mentally ill person, most people do this, but you should actually do that? Are there any things like that that you know of offhand?
Yeah, so I think the first is don't underestimate your impact. So this is a very, very common mistake that humans make. So like
Mm-hmm.
let's say you invite a friend to a party and they say, "No, I don't, no thank you."
Mm-hmm.
And then you invite them again and they say no thank you again, and you invite them a third time and they say no thank you. You
Mm-hmm.
assume that they don't want to be invited, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
truth is that your invitation in and of itself can mean a lot. Like they can have social anxiety or they can be busy and they can feel like, oh, it's like really nice that he keeps inviting me, even though I can't go. And for friends who are struggling with mental illness, you can even like kind of asking them like, hey, is there some way that I can support you? And they say, no, I'm fine. And then you ask again, is there some way I can support you? And they say, no, I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you're asking, even though you don't see it helping, doesn't mean that it isn't incredibly helpful. So I think the biggest mistake that people tend to make is they undervalue their own contribution to a relationship because they don't see a change in the relationship because of their efforts. But especially with mental illness, if you're doing something and they don't seem to be changing at all, you could actually be what's keeping them afloat. Because generally speaking, mental illness has a downward trend. So even if you're like, hey man, do you want to talk every now and then? And they seem to be doing like the same level of depression,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, generally speaking, you're probably grossly underestimating how helpful you actually are to that person.
Okay.
So I'd say just, do what you think is right as a friend and don't get biased by the perception that it's not working,
Gotcha.
which is bizarre, right? By the perception that it isn't working because it seems like it's not working. So why would you continue doing it? But it has immense value.
Gotcha. Because there's some internal improvement that's happening. There's an intervention there that feels good, even if you don't see like an external change in behavior, basically.
Exactly. Even though they never come to your party,
Mm-hmm.
you make them feel wanted and cared for, which is hard to see. And it's also hard for them to express.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also where you can just kind of check in with them. Hey, I keep on asking you if you want to come to the parties or not. I'm not sure if you're busy or what. Like, do you want me to keep inviting you? Just ask them. They'll be
Gotcha.
like, yeah, like, please let me know when you have a party.
Okay. How do you determine one of the most frustrating parts about mental stuff is that you can't force people obviously to do things. They have to make the choices on their own. What level of intervention, I guess, all right, let's say that you have a friend. I'll use an example. So you have a friend with like really big social anxiety, right? And you know that they've been like they are trying to like see more people, like in larger groups of friends or whatever. How do like is should you make some positive effort to like kind of push them like more, or do you leave that entirely in their court and you just don't ever push at all? Or like say you have a friend with depression or whatever. I know like for instance like Reckful would stay in bed sometimes for months because he was so depressed and he would never get out. Like do you ever like show up at that person's house and it's like, get up, we're going outside, like come on? Like do you think that those types of interventions are responsible, or do you think that you're depriving the other person of their own choices too much? Or how do you view stuff like that? Like when can you make a determination, as we're not professionals, for when like you like should intervene a little bit more to help somebody that's kind of struggling with that kind of stuff?
What do you think? What's your compass?
um I guess the way that I view it is that if I feel like somebody is engaging in a behavior that seems to me to just be incredibly destructive and or self-destructive, I guess, and it doesn't seem like there is any benefit for them to continue to pursue that behavior, and if I have evidence in the past that intervening seems to have positive impacts. So for instance, I know that sometimes people will be depressed, they don't want to come out, like blah, blah, but every time you get them out, they seem to have a really good experience, and they'll even admit as much. That like usually those are the types of interventions I would try to push for, because I know that if I can at least get them to move a little bit, that they'll start to feel better for having moved. Yeah.
Sounds like a great answer to me,
Okay.
right? So
Okay.
I think that this is where this also leads to a lot of confusion. I think that sometimes we forget that mental health is more than treatment.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's so much more than treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And friendship is one of the best things that you can do for someone with mental health, right? Like you can look at studies that show, I mean, so you can look at studies with like pets, and like
Mhm.
pets improve cardiovascular health, they improve mental health. It's not a treatment, it's not medicine, but it can still help immensely. And so I think you should think about what your dharma or duty as a friend is.
Mhm.
And that dharma is going to be different from the dharma of a mental health professional. Because it is grossly inappropriate for me to show up at my patient's door. Right? It's like, what if they just like, are they depressed, or do they think I'm a fucking asshole and just stopped taking my calls and responding
Yeah.
to my emails? So I think you should do your duty as a friend. And if that means showing up and crossing certain boundaries that maybe a mental health professional can't cross,
Mhm.
because then that's okay. I mean, I think that that's what friends are for, right?
Okay.
And I think the main thing to think about there is, just to really be very careful about examining your own feelings, and also to check in with them
Mhm.
about, like, I think friends need to learn, like, just in general, as a society, we need to learn to have like more conversations about, the meta level of our relationship. So
Yeah, I noticed that we rely a lot on context clues or on body language sometimes when, like people, we because of all the sexual assault allegations, we went over a lot of this, and the answer that I always give for 99% of like confusion, and I'm sure everybody talking about relationships, same thing is like just have a conversation, like just talk about this, like have it, like why would you try to guess, like don't try to figure out like how they're feeling or like just talk about it, like have a conversation is the easiest way to elucidate, like the issues, and it seems like so many people don't do that, have any of those meta level conversations about any of their relationships,
yeah,
sexual or non-sexual or friendships, anything. Yeah.
yeah, we just don't talk about it.
Hmm.
What's our relationship?
You and me,
Mm-hmm.
quasi friendly, quasi professional. I
Great.
guess we talk on stream. Yeah, I enjoy talking to you. Yeah.
Yeah, same.
Hmm. Okay.
And so I think of us as colleagues on the road to becoming friends.
Okay. You play Dota though, not League, right?
Yeah, so,
Significant road bump, but
can't have everything.
yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to think of.
Have you played Dota?
I, are you? Do you know the sunken cost rule?
Yeah,
Yeah, some
fair
people call it
enough.
a fallacy. It's not a fallacy, okay? I've sunk too much time into League to ever learn another game. I can't
Yeah,
switch now. Even if switching at this point in my life would produce better outcomes for me, just can't.
that's
Okay, I'm
uh,
dug into League. I'm sorry.
you won't catch me saying this anywhere else, Destiny, but it's not, it seems to me like they're both great games. And it's just,
Really?
yeah.
Oh man, I have such a my view of humanity worsens every time I get into a new lobby. But okay, I admire your
New lobby and LOL.
yes, a
No,
new
I mean,
game.
that I'll agree with. I think the fact that your view of humanity, but that has nothing to do with the game. That has to do with the players.
Oh, I mean the game itself is okay. The game itself is pretty good. But
It's a
unfortunately,
good
you
game,
have to
man.
do it 9 other people, God willing, alongside you, going after hopefully the same goals. But
Well, I mean,
yeah,
hopefully five of them are not going after the same goal as you.
yeah, oh yeah, sure, yeah.
But
um, what is your end goal with your? You talk a lot about the organization that you kind of have with all the people that you're training up to be counselors, or like what
coaches.
capacity do you, coaches? Okay, coaches. What capacity do you want that organization to serve in the future? Like, what's your end goal with that? Like
So
realistic end goal and then like dream end goal, I guess.
so it's interesting. So the short answer is I don't have an end goal, because this thing was never conceived to go to a particular place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the first question you asked me is like, what did you expect from Twitch, and have you been surprised? And the
Mm-hmm.
answer is I expected, I don't even remember what I expected, but the short answer was not much, and I've been very surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird, like, because I mean, every step of the way has been in trying to figure out like what is the next step I need to take. It's really not about an end goal. And the reason we started the coaching program is because I got thousands of requests per month for people like, hey, can I talk to Dr. K?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll pay you any amount of money for just 1 hour of your time.
Mm-hmm.
And as lucrative as that may be, I didn't think I could actually help people. So then the question becomes, so one of my friends, I was talking to one of my colleagues who's also a psychiatrist, and she was saying, like, jokingly, like, either you need to, duplicate yourself or like maybe come up with some kind of courses or something like that, like write a book.
Mhm.
And what she was saying is that you should write a book. And I was like, I wonder if I can duplicate myself.
Yeah.
And this goes to the idea that I'm something special, which people think I'm special, but I don't think I'm that special. And so the more special I am, the harder it is to duplicate myself. But the real question is, because I did feel like, so the reason we started the coaching program is because I started on stream, and what I really wanted to show people. So the reason we started streaming was because I was having individual conversations with gamers for like 4 years, and it was like the same 35 like problem points,
Yeah.
like 35 problems that pretty much all gamers, like any given gamer is going to fall into, like 99% of them are going to fall into these like 35 issues. So my
Mhm.
thought was like, I'm having the same fucking conversation with like a dozen people. What if I just stream that conversation? Could people watching benefit?
Mhm.
Turns out that the answer is like sort of yes. Then the question is like, but we want one-on-one. And I'm like, can I really transform someone's life by streaming? Some people will actually say yes. I still tend to be pretty skeptical. And I find that it's like hard to substitute one-on-one support with like
Mhm.
YouTube videos, even if the topics are the
Remember,
same.
don't ever underestimate the impact you can have on somebody. But
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I've learned that.
yeah.
But then my thought was like, okay, so what's missing from Healthy Gamer? Sure, I can go on stream and I can have these conversations and I can teach about stuff.
Mhm.
But what's missing is one-on-one, and that's why we started coaching.
Sure.
Now, the interesting thing, that's there are deficiencies that have come out of coaching, which is that like people want, so like they want more in depth than what we can offer on stream, and the
Mhm.
coaches have a skill set, but they don't have my knowledge base. So the next thing that we're working on Healthy Gamer is like, can you hold on a second? I'll just show you.
Yeah.
So So what I basically noticed is that like people are asking for more in-depth stuff about meditation, or more in-depth stuff about Ayurveda, or like
Mhm.
more in-depth stuff about like alexithymia and getting in touch with your emotions. So and the coaches are actually really helpful, and they're good outcomes from our coaching program. Um, but they don't have the depth of knowledge, which actually people are sort of ask us to stream about stuff. Where now the problem that we're running into is I don't think streaming is the best way to disseminate. Uh, hold on. Is the best way to disseminate like comprehensive knowledge. Does that make sense?
Sure, because you can't be responsive to like individual like questions, or because you have to break things down on an individual level for somebody to understand, or
Because my understanding is that streaming people jump in and out. So
oh, okay,
let's
okay.
let's do this. So we're gonna go. Okay. So I'm gonna maximize this. Share my screen. Okay. Uh, okay. Can you see this?
Um, I'm gonna click something to watch stream. Yes, okay.
Can you see the Word doc?
Yeah.
So like, so the next thing for Healthy Gamer is this.
Mhm.
So this is like essentially the outline of a book about meditation.
Mhm.
And so this is like what's come out from our coaching program is that people want more. Let me try to find just one example. But yeah, so let's do like the anxiety primer. So like this is just like my understanding of anxiety and
Mhm.
all the different kinds of anxiety that people can experience. And this is
Mhm.
what our community needs next. So first it was streaming, then it was like, okay, people need one-on-one, and then people like our coaches can help them with ego, but they don't have quite the depth of knowledge about how to like the know-how of how to remove ego. They can
Mhm.
actually help. They're actually pretty good with ego.
Okay.
Um, and so like this is what's next. And where does it end up? I'm not quite sure, to be honest,
Okay.
because I just don't I just don't know. I mean, I'm going to try to help. So the other thing when it comes to dharma or duty is like it occurs to me that I have a so when you think about karma and dharma, so to kind of tie things up, So I think I was given a very unique set of circumstances in life. And I think that with ability comes responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it was weird. I was talking to like this guy named Bobby Scar, and he was kind of saying like, I predicted someone like you would show up on Twitch one day. He was like, I called it.
Okay.
And I think that there's a group. So what Healthy Gamer is about is it's about healthy gamers. So it's not actually about like treating video game addiction. It's about like building a healthy life. This is what we've been talking about. There's a difference between mental illness and like building happiness and fulfillment. And that's really what our goals are as an organization.
Yeah, it's like the difference between going to a hospital and being sent out when you're no longer dying versus actually like working out, exercising, having like a healthy body. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I
Hmm.
think the thing that's been really confusing from an organization standpoint or a stream standpoint is people, because I talk about emotions, they assume that that's therapy. But
Hmm.
no, like I think that's the fucking problem with our society is that we don't have these conversations about relationships. We don't
Hmm.
have conversations about emotions. You were kind of saying we weren't taught how to be happy. Absolutely. That's what I'm trying to fix.
Hmm.
Is we weren't taught how to like gain meaning and purpose in life. We weren't taught how we as human beings work. We have classes about science and mathematics and economics, but nothing about why you can't stop drinking soda.
Hmm.
And so what our mission uh, is just to help people put their lives together and to become healthy gamers.
Hmm.
Right. And I don't want like I'm not really for abstinence from video games. I think it's necessary for some people and
Sure.
certainly for some period of time, but like we want to build healthy gamers, and when there are enough healthy gamers, I guess at some point I'm going to burn out or quit. But
You'll
generally
probably be
speaking,
working for a while, but yeah.
I mean, so I'm
Hmm.
just going to try to help people. So I think I kind of view our organization and where it's going in the same way that I think about, because it's the only way you can do it mentally and stay sane. When I'm
Hmm.
working in the emergency room, it's like, what's my end goal? I have no fucking clue. It depends on what walks in the door.
Sure.
And as
Okay.
long as people are walking in the door and asking us to do stuff,
Hmm.
we're going to do our best to do it.
Okay. I don't know how many questions I've asked you. You've gone over on stream a million times, so I'm sorry if I'm hitting a lot of like common talking points. I guess just like a final question then, so we draw to an end here.
Sure.
For because a lot of people in my audience might be listening that haven't heard these things before. Um, in terms of if you have like new people listening, what do you think is like the most positive thing an individual can do to make like great strides towards becoming mentally healthier, that you think most people don't already do? Like, what's like one thing that you think is missing from a lot of Twitch audience's life that they could be doing that would help them greatly?
I mean, I have a generic answer and then I have a specific answer because I feel like the generic answer is like not actionable, which frustrates me. So the generic answer is I think you should understand yourself in the same way that you try to understand external things. So in your
Sure.
audience in particular, so Destiny, I think you've cultivated a good audience or attitude or culture of
Hmm.
like critical thinking. The
Hmm.
problem is that we don't critically think about ourselves.
Yeah.
Practically, what I would say is that a lot of people, I suspect, in your audience think they think critically about themselves,
Yeah.
right? But the truth is that they don't. So here's what I'd say.
Hmm.
A classic example of this is like the gamer who feels like they're in control of their emotions because they don't cry during a sad movie or can watch horror films or things like that, right?
Hmm.
Like they don't have emotional responses the way that other people do. And they pride
Hmm.
themselves on this. That's not
Yeah.
being in control of your emotions.
Hmm.
That's just numbing your emotions. So practically what I would, if I had to give someone a practical tip, it's look at your behavior and try to figure out what are the different variables that influence your behavior. And unless you can do something arbitrary for no reason, you're not in control of yourself.
Hmm.
So if people think that you're in control of yourself and you can't pick, the last thing that you ate that was unhealthy, unless you can knock that out of your diet for 60 days, you're not in control.
Hmm.
And then tunnel down into what is it that contributes to behavior, because behavior is really, really complicated. A lot of
Yeah.
variables. And understand your behavior and understand yourself. And for people who want to be successful, I don't think they understand. Like everyone looks for success outside of themselves. They're like, you've got
Hmm.
to do this, or like, I remember there was some guy on YouTube that was spamming, maybe due to my search history or cookies or whatever, about how
Yeah.
he like reads 1,000 books, and I'm like, I don't think reading, like, we all think that reading 1,000 books makes you successful. Like, sure, reading is important. I've read a fuck ton of books. But I don't believe that success comes from doing some specific formula externally. I think you just got to understand, like, how you work as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what people need to, like, take away is, like, understand how you work. Because we're playing this game of life without understanding the buttons on the controller.
Yeah.
It's like,
do you have a good I 100% agree with what you're saying. Do you have good like tricks to check if you're lying to yourself?
yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the biggest thing to understand about lying to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how the mind works. Okay, I'm going to do an abbreviated version. You guys can check this
Yeah, that's
out
fine.
in the webinars and stuff because I've explained this with whiteboard and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I also think that Eastern psychology in a lot of ways is superior to Western psychology because of the way in which it was developed. That's maybe a conversation for a different day.
Sure.
But our mind has an emotional component. This is called the manas.
Mm-hmm.
And the manas is the emotional mind and also reacts to things. So if you think about, do you like sushi?
No.
Okay. When you ate your first piece of sushi, how quickly did you know that you didn't like it?
I don't know. I usually I eat something, I think about it, I'd swallow it. I can tell usually in a I don't know, 10, 15 seconds. It doesn't take me that long to figure it out.
I would say even less. I would
Sure,
be
yeah.
surprised if it took you longer than a second
Sure.
for you to.
I don't like seafood, so the first time I really tried sushi was like a year ago, but I went to a really nice restaurant with some friends because I wanted to like give it a good try before writing it off. So I really did think about it, but yeah. But
Yeah.
generally, yeah, for like a piece of food I don't like, you usually know pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Right.
even just smelling it.
So there's this one part of your mind that reacts to things. And so the yogis thought that emotions and reactions, like stamping something with like or dislike. Oh, like I like that song, or I don't like that song, or oh, that's a cool shirt, or isn't a cool shirt. The reactionary mind is the same as the emotional mind. So we also tend to experience emotions very rapidly, right? If you walk in and then your ex walks into the same restaurant, you have an emotional reaction that takes less than a second. So your emotional mind acts. That's manas. That's the emotional mind. The second piece of the mind is the buddhi, or the analytical mind, the logical mind. And we all know that like emotions and logic are not the same part, right? Like you can't overcome emotions with logic, or you can, or that's difficult. We can get down into that.
The whole process, CBT, whatever, yeah.
So the thing that people don't understand is that between the emotions and the logic is this thing called the ahamkar, or the ego.
Okay.
And what the ahamkar does is it activates to protect you from negative emotions. So when you feel bad, the ego activates. And then what the ego does is it bullies your intellectual mind into coming up with justifications. And you can argue logically against justifications. And what happens if you like argue with someone about why they do something and they present justifications?
It feels like they'll bounce back and forth between whatever. They'll either invent or fabricate some, or they'll generate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So the question
you're
is,
post hoc rationalizing it. You're doing it after the fact. You don't care what the justification is.
So the question is like how do you know whether your intellectual mind is justifying things or objectively analyzing things? How do you know?
Yeah.
And the short answer is whether your ego is present or not. Right? So even when you have a political argument, if you can calm down and have a discussion with them where their ego is absent, then they can change their mind. So basically, your intellect functions well if your ego is inactive. And when does ego become active? It becomes active when you experience negative emotion, generally speaking. And so it really starts with, it's not about whether you're in control, it's about the presence of or the absence of emotion. And if you can't detect emotion, and you can't detect and notice your ego, then your rational mind is not thinking properly.
Yeah.
So
that just seems scary because I guess when I think of like these sorts of like almost cognitive distortions, like nobody feels like they ever have them. So it seems really like everybody feels like they're honest with themselves.
Yeah. So that's the beauty of what the yogis figured out is they're like, okay, how do I know when my intellect is working properly? It has to do with the presence of emotion and ego. Gotcha. And until you can see and label those things within yourself, then your then your analytical mind will function well. Because you're like, oh, so that's my ego.
The first step then to figuring out if you're lying, if we draw it back then, to figure out if you're lying to yourself, the first step of that process is, can I identify when I'm being emotional?
Yep.
And then if you can do that, then you can bring these topics in a place where you're not being emotional and then analyze them. But if you feel like you're becoming emotional, you have to be able to recognize that in
The
order to
tricky
understand.
thing is that most people aren't going to even be able to recognize their emotions.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. So the
Okay.
first, so I would start by assuming
Mm-hmm.
that if you don't detect emotion, that some emotion is there. You start by
sure.
assuming that you're not actually logical,
Mm-hmm.
because chances are you aren't. And until your like EQ gets well developed and you can detect your emotions and then also detect your ego,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this, like, you can kind of see this where, like, the example that I use is, let's say you ask out a girl and then she says no,
Mm-hmm.
and then you say, she wasn't that attractive anyway. And then you
Mm-hmm.
tell your friends she was like, yeah, I wasn't that into her. Which
Yeah,
is
of
like,
course. Yeah. Yeah. You're a bitch anyway. I never liked you at
exactly,
all.
right? But like that's clearly illogical, but you can't explain
Mhm.
that to that person. And why?
Yeah.
So when she says no, in your emotional mind you feel rejection, and then your ego is like, oh shit, let's tank that. And then
Mm-hmm.
it pumps you up and then it puts other people down. So
For
another
sure.
sign, there are a couple, I'll leave you with one last point because they're not going to be able to detect their emotions. Anytime you're making a comparison, that's ego.
Mm-hmm.
If you are comparing, your logic is incorrect.
Gotcha.
Period.
Okay. One of the as a quick aside, one of the easy I consider myself to be pretty emotionally aware. I'd like to think I am, but then there are times when even I realize way too late oftentimes something as stupid as like, man, I think I just need to fucking eat because I'm in a really bad mood right now. I don't even think I realize it. And then you eat, and then afterwards, once you're out of it, you're like, wow, holy shit, I was really hungry. I can't believe I was just like a huge asshole for 2 hours when I just needed some food. Something as stupid as that. That's arguably less impactful than like having a fight with somebody or having a negative experience with somebody else. So yeah, for sure, I understand what you mean 100%.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. Cool, man.
Okay, cool. I appreciate the conversation. I really
Yeah,
like talking to you. You're
likewise.
yeah. If I have a
Do you,
specific topic, I'll bring it up in the future. What were you saying?
yeah, I was just gonna say, because I remember etiquette from before. So like I assume that everyone knows who you are because I just assume everyone knows who you are. But do you want to tell people if they don't? Like, I was just assuming, but it just occurred to me that maybe people don't know who you are. Do you want to?
Oh, sure. I'm Destiny. I stream at twitch.tv/Destiny. We talk about politics and philosophy a lot, and then we play video games too, depending on what's going on for current events. And yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Destiny. I really appreciate the conversation and I enjoy talking to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it as well. Also, etiquette. Do you want to introduce yourself in case some people watching on my stream might not know who you are?
Yeah, but I mean, I had a chance to talk about myself a lot this
Oh,
stream, so I think people should have figured it. I mean, I imagine.
okay.
Because we talked.
HealthyGamer_GG. You are trying to raise money for something though, right? What do you
Nope.
collect? No, you're
No.
not. Oh, you guys raised all the money you needed.
Yeah, I mean, the community gave us a ton of money, so
Oh,
we're fine. Yeah. So like
wow.
part
You're
of
making the first big business mistake you're making is you have to keep increasing those goals. You got to get more and more and more money,
nope,
right?
that's not what we do. Seriously, Destiny. I know
Okay.
it's bizarre. I mean,
Uh huh.
we've had people try to still give us 5-figure donations and stuff, and we're like, nope. I
Huh.
think we nope.
Okay. Well, that's awesome. Cool. Well, good luck
Yeah.
with what you guys are doing. You're genuinely really cool. There's very, very, very few people that I talk to that I actually respect and look up to, and you're like one of those very few. There's like two people actually. There's you that I really enjoy talking to, and then another guy called Sean Carroll. You two are really awesome people. So
How
yeah, it's
insulting
really
to
cool.
everyone else you've talked to, man.
Most
I
people know that I
appreciate
have
the
very
praise.
fucking negative views of everybody. And I mean, like, in terms of like, if you say something, I'm more likely to believe it without feeling like I have to go and like check it and I'm instantly like incredibly hostile or combative towards a thought. Like, if you say something that challenges like a preconceived notion that I have, I'm more likely to like default assume I might be incorrect on something and then really ponder what you're saying and try to like incorporate that into what I'm thinking. Like, yeah.
Can I ask you? I appreciate that, man. I really
Yeah.
respect you as well. And we don't do much on Twitch that isn't like our stuff because we don't have a whole lot of time to stream, and I think there are a lot of people to help.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do love talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can I toss out one last thing? I'll try to send you the paper. But
Sure.
I had a
Throw it out.
wild thought recently, and I
Mm-hmm.
just love to get your thoughts on it. So there
Yeah.
was recently a study, I think, on because we've talked a little bit about psychedelics before, I think,
Yeah.
or you've talked about it or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if you and I have talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people ask me questions about psychedelics. So I saw an interesting study, and it just really I clicked in some way, and I don't know if this is completely idiotic. So there was a
Mm-hmm.
study, I think, with MDMA or psilocybin, I forget, where
Okay.
something like 68% of people who used MDMA or psilocybin felt a connection with like some kind of being, and the being was like positive,
Okay.
and it like cared about them. And I was just really surprised by the high percentage of a common experience, because my assumption would have been that if you use psychedelics, like I know that there are some substances that, like MDMA, for example, makes you feel like more connected to people.
Oh
But I was
yes.
surprised by the uniformity of their experience of like presence of this other being or
Hmm.
beings. And then I was kind of thinking like, oh, that's actually like scientifically, that's very interesting that they have a consistent experience across all kinds of random people, because I would have expected all kinds of random things.
Okay.
Well, I mean, within certain bounds, right? So like we know that
Sure.
MDMA like increases your like empathy and stuff like that, but
Hmm.
to detect a being is a strange scientific result.
Sure.
And it got me wondering whether like actually MDMA and psilocybin are um, maybe like the next version of the telescope, in the sense that
Maybe.
in we have a general reality that we can perceive, and then as human beings we develop instruments,
Hmm.
and then anyone who looks through the telescope sees a relatively common thing,
Hmm.
even though like normal people can't see it. But when you have enough human beings who share a common sensory experience, at what point does that become reality as opposed to just something that you're hallucinating?
For sure. Um, Obviously, very responsible. Make sure that everything is safe. Consult a doctor if you're taking a drug. Like SSRIs will interact with
Oh yeah, I wouldn't
mushrooms,
recommend
LSD.
taking psychedelics. I'm not. That's
Oh,
not.
okay.
I'm
You
not.
don't. Okay. Good.
Sorry, I should have been clear. I was just
Oh yeah.
wondering what you think about the principle of.
Uh-huh.
Sorry, what you think about the principle of like whether it's possible that psychedelics could actually give us frontiers into reality that we're otherwise not able to perceive, much like a telescope. It's a theoretical question.
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm actually going to have a conversation with tomorrow. I'm going to butcher his last name. Will Sui? Siu?
Will suit. Yeah,
Sue.
yeah.
Yeah, about that. Yeah, because I had
Hey,
a
great.
really, yeah, huge mushroom trip that I still have trouble making sense of. Um, I think that the perspectives that you gain on stuff like mushrooms or LSD are invaluable. Um, it's hard. I don't want to have this conversation. I'm not trying to recommend drugs to your audience. I'm trying to be responsible with that. But like, there's definitely um, there are worlds that exist under psychedelic drugs that are inaccessible, in my opinion, to most people.
That's fine. So I
Mhm.
also I'm not recommending. So I've also, just so
Sure.
you guys know, from a safety perspective, I've had
Mhm.
several people reach out to me when we've talked about psychedelics, actually saying they have PTSD or bad anxiety from psychedelics. So psychedelic usage
Yeah,
can actually be like very harmful. Um,
for
so
sure.
and I think if you guys want more information, Will is a great person to talk to.
Mhm.
So the question that I have for you though is, do you think that those experiences are ensconced to you, or do you think they could be reflective of actually an objective reality outside of your mind?
Um, Man, sorry, I'm trying to think of like abbreviated forms of this. The
You don't have to answer
problem.
now. You just
Oh, sure.
I
Oh,
just wanted to get your thoughts on, like just I want you to just
yeah.
think about it.
But the big problem that I had was that I had a very, very large mushroom trip, and it actually like that term that you use, objective reality, is one that I don't use anymore because that big mushroom trip really undermined my opinion of how well I can be in tune with any sort of objective reality. When you've done a certain, maybe similar to what schizophrenics feel, when you've done enough of a certain substance that can induce hallucinations or make your senses otherwise lie to you or cause you to have a conscious experience that feels very otherworldly or unrelated to your normal one, I think it really undermines your sense of how well you can truly understand any part of the world. Because yeah, for most people, you've never experienced having a sensory organ lie to you. Like you don't know what it's like for your eye or your ear to report something that absolutely doesn't exist. And once you've experienced that in like in a highly drugged state, I think it feels a little bit weird to it feels a little bit weird to think that like you can have this like super big key into like an objective reality. This kind of like goes away from your question though, but your original question is like, could we use these to gain further insights into objective reality? I'm guessing because you're saying that we all have shared experiences, it seems to be on these drugs. It's possible that because we all have like similar backgrounds, and because we all have like similar like
Hmm.
shared biology, that doing like a certain type of drug is more likely to bring a certain experience up to the surface. So maybe, for instance, Western people would report a different experience on a psychedelic drug than like maybe Indians or Japanese people or some form of Eastern
It's a good thought.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. When you said, yeah, it's not surprising to me that people would report similar experiences just because we all have like so much shared culture and biology. But I think it's worth exploring. And I think that the type of shared experiences that you have, that in and of itself might be insightful. So, for instance, this is conjecture, maybe true, maybe not. But a lot of atheists might say, like, oh, gods aren't important. People don't need those. And then let's say that all of the human population tries mushrooms and 95% of people report, I had an experience where I felt incredibly close to a divine being and it made me feel so incredibly at peace. Well, maybe coming out of that experience, maybe think like, well, okay, maybe it's a little bit foolish to completely throw out the idea of any type of like godlike figure. It seems like it's pretty integral to like, the human psyche. Like, so yeah, I do think that there could be something worth investigating there. Sorry, that was a really roundabout
Interesting.
way of answering that question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what these conversations are about, man.
Sure, yeah. Also for MDMA, I would stake money on this. Not that I was seriously going to do it, but I do not believe that two people in the same room, no matter how much they hate each other, I do not think it's possible that two people could do MDMA and come out of that room still hating each other. It is an incredibly empathetic drug. Like, yeah, it's yeah, the connections you feel in that are unbelievable. Jesus, but maybe that's because I'm normally like an emotionally disconnected person. Maybe I'm getting closer to what how people normally experience emotions. But yeah, wow, that's what I
Yeah,
would say
so
for
I
MDMA.
mean, seriously, Dustin, I would be careful, dude. Like for
Of course,
people
yeah,
watching and stuff too, because
for
like this
sure, yeah.
stuff. So just so you guys know, and you can ask Will more about this, but Will
Hmm.
was telling me that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy
Hmm.
is normally done like you'll do like maybe 4 or 5 months of therapy with 3 uses of psychedelics in between with appropriate time to process and like controlled amounts. I
Hmm.
mean, I've really heard people should really be careful because, like, part of the problem is you don't know what you're getting,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
and
I would
people,
consider myself like I think I have a very, very strong and well put together mind, and I completely underestimated psilocybin mushrooms, and I deal with things like anxiety and stuff now. I can't smoke. Not that I would recommend it, but I can't smoke weed, for instance, without having panic attacks, which I'd never experienced prior to doing psychedelic mushrooms. So it's definitely something that you should be
yeah. So you
incredibly
got,
respectful of and very careful
yep,
of. Hmm.
yeah. I mean, I would really just steer clear. I mean, I know that a lot of people are into it, but like, it's
Sure.
just, I mean, there can, I mean, it can be harmful. But talk to Will. I think he knows more than I do about that. So,
Yeah, it'll be a fun conversation. Yeah.
all
Okay.
right, man. Well, thank you so
Awesome.
much for talking, man. I appreciate it.
Yep. I appreciate the conversation. It's been fun. I'll
Take
poke you
care.
if I ever have questions in the future. Yeah. Have a good
Yeah.
one.